Pelote, and for my senior project, I wrote a series of articles relating to sustainable fashion. My goal was really to experiment with four modes of journalistic writing. So here is sustainable fashion, history, trends, designers, and awards. So sustainable fashion gained prominence in the 1960s, with consumers demanding a change to the poor environmental impact that clothing manufacturing was having on the environment. And because of these consumer demands, throughout history, the fashion industry has been forced to reevaluate their supply chain. And while designers and manufacturers are a crucial part of making fashion sustainable, the consumer plays a large part as well. Because if enough consumers are mindful about their purchases, the fashion industry is forced to react accordingly. Now, the definition of sustainable fashion is somewhat arbitrary. When I was researching for this particular article, I saw a lot of terms like eco, organic, and green used interchangeably in different articles. But what the sustainable fashion movement has shown to be a universal message is that it aims to be a movement, not a trend. Sustainable fashion is really trying percent of all carbon emissions. And if there is no progression towards a more sustainable model, its carbon emission will be closer to 26% by 2050. While cotton is not 100% sustainable, polyester emits nearly 3 times more CO2, and 60% of clothing has polyester in it, so this just is detrimental to our environment. 85% of wasted fabric ends up in landfills or is burned, creating fossil fuels. And since 60% of our fabrics are synthetic, this also worsens our climate. It's also important to note that in 15 years, the time that people wear their clothes before throwing them away has lessened by 40%. So clothing doesn't just pollute and affect how we breathe, it also affects our oceans. And according to the UN Environmental Program, an estimate of 1.4 million trillion plastic fibers are in the ocean. One of the issues with consumers of sustainable apparel is that the majority of them are not typical consumers. They're often consumers who are attempting to be entirely sustainable. But this poses a problem because the movement is not appealing to the masses. These consumers are not purchasing from fast fashion brands, they're buying almost exclusively secondhand or recycled clothing. So fast fashion has had a fairly rapid increase since its inception. Fast fashion clothing manufacturing doubled from 2000 to 2014. So the rates of the average consumer's purchases are now currently up to 60% more per year. And 95% of the clothing that is disposed of can be recycled in some way. So when I learned this fact, what could happen and what seems to be the logical conclusion would be to recycle these fabrics into new clothing. And these sustainable brands, they don't just have to make their clothing sustainable, they have to consider so many different aspects of sustainability, like environmentally friendly materials and fabrics, a sustainable business model and practices, fair working conditions, a long-lasting design. So there's a lot that goes into a sustainable business. And while the growth of the sustainable fashion movement has invited companies to branch out and implement sustainable practices into their brands, there have been some brands that have taken advantage of this. So some brands have marketed their products as sustainable when they're not actually sustainable. This is also called greenwashing. Designers now have to produce collections faster and more often, which just adds more pressure and stress to them. And the issue of price, one of the main issues that designers have, sustainable designers, have can be solved by the designer just having the knowledge of the consumer's wants. This allows the designer to pay for the collection ahead of time. And because the consumer's wants and purchases are already factored into the equation, small clothing brands can lower the prices. And this allows consumers to support these small sustainable brands, because one of the biggest concerns or complaints that I've heard is that sustainable brands tend to be on the pricey side. So these are 5 sustainable fashion trends that hopefully you can implement into your own wardrobe. The first fashion trend I have is a capsule wardrobe, which is your basic essential clothing. This term was coined by Susie Faux. She was the owner of Wardrobe, a London boutique in the 1970s. Now, mass consumption is ever prevalent in the fashion industry. The world's consumption is 400% more than it was 20 years ago. So, what's great about a capsule wardrobe is that it cuts down the amount of clothing that we purchase, which in turn reduces the amount of materials and resources used to make our clothing. And it also saves us money, and who doesn't want to save money? And how many times do you look into your closet and feel like you have nothing to wear? I do this all the time. And I feel like it's because so often we buy these pieces that don't work with other items in our closet, or we buy items on an impulse buy. So a capsule wardrobe can simplify our decision choices while also creating simple, effective choices. And because these items are not trends, they can be worn for years, which is the antithesis of fast fashion, which encourages mass consumption. A capsule wardrobe values quality over quantity. But one of the downsides of having a capsule wardrobe is that sometimes it can limit you in style and diversity, but some of these other tips can help with that. Fashion trend number 2 is buying secondhand clothing. So secondhand clothing is far superior to new clothing in terms of its effect on the environment, because no extra materials are needed, which means that no more waste is made. And the fashion industry accounts for 4% of the world's waste every single year. So buying secondhand clothing is probably one of, if not the most sustainable ways to buy clothing, just due to the lack of resources it uses. But one downside of secondhand clothing is that there's often not a return policy, so just make sure you really want what you're buying. But I would say that's a good rule of thumb in general. The third fashion trend I have is to rent your clothing. And a common misconception of rentals is that they are for formal dresses and suits and fancy occasions, but you can also rent casual clothing too. There's places like Amore and Letot, which offer rental services, and Letot in particular actually allows you to keep your items for however long you want, and you also have the option to purchase them if you are obsessed with them. But if you do have some kind of fancy event coming up, Rent the Runway is a really good way to go. I just checked them out. They have a lot of designer brands, very beautiful clothing. So it's something that I plan to rent from in the future. And the best part about renting your clothing is that it's cheaper than buying them. So you're able to keep your capsule wardrobe simple and organized, but you also have the ability to take a fashion risk and wear that prom dress or one occasion dress without it just sitting in your closet. But one downside to renting your clothing is that sometimes the items have to be dry cleaned, so it does use more resources, but it is more environmentally friendly than owning. The fourth fashion trend I have is upcycling. Upcycling is the process of using old clothing and materials to make new and inventive clothing. When I was in Los Angeles, I was along Melrose Avenue, and that was probably the first time I saw a lot of upcycled clothing. They have really fun consignment shops, and they often take name brands and they just refashion them. So you'll have something unique that nobody else will be seen wearing. But if you're not from Los Angeles, just go to one of your local vintage shops or consignment shops and you'll find many things to repurpose, although I would probably wait until the pandemic is over. Fashion trend number 5 is fabric innovation. So there's so many different materials that are so much more sustainable than the standard leather and cotton. Recycled plastic water bottles, ethanol, pineapple leaves, those are all used to create new fabrics in innovative ways. Organic hemp and organic linen are the more common sustainable fabrics. They both are great because they use few resources, little water, no pesticides, they fertilize naturally, and the organic linen actually has the ability to grow in poor soil quality, which is great because we do have a lot of that. Recycled cotton is another great sustainable material, and standard cotton is the most used fabric in the fashion industry. So what's great about recycled cotton is that it's just a way to reuse the overabundance of standard cotton that we have. So Stella McCartney is a luxury sustainable fashion designer. She is an innovator in the sustainable fashion community and in the movement. She was born on September 13th of 1971 in London, England, to a former member of the Beatles, Sir Paul McCartney, and photographer, musician, and animal rights activist, Linda McCartney. She graduated from Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design in 1995, and then in 1997, she became the creative director of fashion luxury brand Chloe. In 2003, she married her husband, Alistair Willis, whom she has 4 children with. So in the photo on the right, you can see McCartney holding up Stan Smith, her version of Stan Smith Adidas. She did collaborate with Adidas, and she made the very popular Stan Smith tennis shoe with vegan leather and glues free of animal derivatives, making it 100% vegan and sustainable. And the shoes that she designs for her own brand are made out of vinyl and plastic instead of leather, and her belts and bags use raffia and fabric, as she, from the very beginning of her brand, has refused to incorporate any leather or fur into any of her clothing. So Stella McCartney has talked a lot about sustainability and how she views sustainability and what it means to her. And she has said that she is not sustainable because of the creativity or the challenges that come with constantly curating and finding ways around using toxic materials and non-sustainable practices. For example, it took her 10 years to find an alternative for PVC or polyvinyl chloride, which is a very harmful material, even cancerous. She's fashioned herself her brand's own innovator by creating skin-free skin and fur-free fur made of organic fibers. If I were to describe her designs, I would say that they have a tailored and feminine yet sexy feel to them. And while her clothing is haute couture, there's a wearable aspect to it. She really cares about the average consumer, and she's not lost in the editorial aspect of haute couture like so many other fashion designers, especially luxury fashion designers. She was quoted saying, "It's not about what it looks like in the studio or on the runway, it's what it looks like on a real person that matters." So she really caters to the average woman. So the Green Carpet Fashion Awards is a sustainable celebration. They hosted their very first virtual ceremony just this past October 10th, 2020, at the Teatro alla Scala Opera House in Milan, Italy. The theme was togetherness and rebirth, which is very appropriate for the times that we're in. And the celebration really honed in on the importance of environmental sustainability. So in terms of making their event virtual, they really wanted to stray away from the typical virtual event during the pandemic. In their words, it was Stone Age. And so what they did was they collaborated with ARHT Media to incorporate holograms into their ceremony. What's truly amazing about the Green Carpet Fashion Awards is that they're an anomaly in a sense. They speak on fashion's environmental footprint and what we can do to be more sustainable in our everyday lives, but they also acknowledge the people behind the garment industry, which is somewhat rare. So the Green Carpet Fashion Awards really exemplifies the spirit of sustainable fashion. Okay, and for acknowledgements, I just wanted to say thank you to my sponsor, Kate Albers. Thank you to my Whittier Scholars professors, and thank you to the Whittier Scholars Program. I really appreciate you all so very much.